Hello, I'm Dave Moore with PITC, and today we're going to be going over the testing procedure for an RPBA. The backflow device that we're going to be testing today is a ZURN Wilkins model 975XL2. The first thing we do in this test is we flush our test cocks to make sure that there's no dirt or debris in them. Once we've flushed our test cocks, we take our high hose and connect it to test cock number 2. The first test of an RP, we test our check 1 and forward, or our pressure differential across check 1. The minimum spring tension that we can have on check valve 1 out of an RP is 5 psi. So we must have a 5 psi reading on our differential pressure gauge for this test to pass, maintained for 2 minutes. We're first going to pressurize our gauge. We're going to bleed our gauge. Once our gauge is bled, we're going to shut off isolation valve 1, and we're going to open up test cock number 3. We're going to wait for our needle to settle out, and the pressure that we're reading now is our pressure differential across check 1. We're reading a pressure differential of 10.2 psi, well above the 5 psi minimum, so this would be recorded as a pass if it holds for 2 minutes. The next test that we do is we see when our relief valve is going to open. Again, our relief valve must open at a pressure differential of 2 psi. So it must open before our needle hits 2 psi. So we're going to do that now. We do that by slowly opening the needle valve on our gauge and observing when the water comes out of our relief. So my relief just opened at 3.5 psi. We're then going to open up the needle valve all the way to exercise that relief fully. Close it up. So we opened at 3.5. We had a minimum opening point of 2 psi. This would be recorded as a pass. We then subtract that 3.5 from the 10 psi differential across check 1, and that number will give us our buffer. So 10 subtract 3.5 is a 6.5 psi buffer, so that would be recorded as a pass as well. We're going to move on to the next test of our RP. So we're going to close our test cocks, remove our high hose from test cock 2, and put it onto test cock number 3. We're going to re-establish pressure in our device. We're going to pressurize and bleed our gauge. Once our gauge is bled, we're going to shut off isolation valve 1. And now the test we do now is on check valve 2 and forward pressure, or our pressure differential across check valve 2. On check valve 2 of an RP, we have a minimum spring tension of 1 psi. So again, we must hold above 1 psi for 2 minutes. We test this by opening up test cock number 4. Once our needle is steadied, we observe the pressure at 2.6 psi, well above our 1 psi minimum. So again, this would be recorded as a pass, as long as it holds steady for 2 minutes. We'd then move on to the next part of our test. We'll close our test cocks. We'll take our high hose off test cock number 3 and move it to test cock number 4. And the last test of our RP, we're testing our check 2 and reverse flow. Again, we must hold a constant pressure for 2 minutes. So first we'll open up isolation valve 1 to repressurize our device. We'll open up test cock number 4 slowly to pressurize and bleed our gauge. Once our gauge is pressurized and bled, we will shut off isolation valve 1 and open up test cock number 3. And then we're going to drop our gauge to a more observable level. Again, we must hold a constant pressure for 2 minutes on this test. So if we hold a constant pressure for 2 minutes, we would observe this as closed, and we would close our test cocks and put the device back to service.